discussing a podcast with Chelsea Finn. She was on Peter Beale's podcast about AI. It's called Robot Minds. And shout out to Peter. He this is not the first time we're reviewing one of his podcasts because this is testament for how useful it is. What Peter is doing is he's giving people like me an insight, a glimpse into what academic research is doing, and he's doing it in a very digestible way. So really shout out to Peter. Great job. Chelsea Finn's professor or assistant professor, something like that at Stanford. Doesn't matter. She's a very successful, young, up and coming AI researcher. And the reason she's up and coming is because obviously she's very talented, but I think she's doing very important, interesting work in new fields. So her field is meta learning, learn how to learn. The idea of finding systems, particularly in robotics, that can learn while doing stuff and then learn how to learn. Why is that important? Well, she says in the podcast that fundamentally the problem with robotics is we don't have enough data. So and this is the key. I mean, you can't learn how to, let's say you can't teach a robot how to pick up stuff and all of that stuff, or how to drive a car if you don't have enough data. So data is a problem, and we have to find ways so the robots can leverage what's out there, create more data, and then also learn how to learn, because we can't always retrain a model for every particular task. So this is sort of in the realm of what David Eagleman's talking about the elastic brain, about how we humans have this ability to learn how to learn. We don't know exactly how we can do it, but we can. Our cells can literally relearn. An eye cell can turn into an ear cell, and things like that. So hearing can be, our body can teach itself to hear, to feel, with tissue and cells that weren't even designed to do that from the beginning. We humans have the ability to learn. If I drop you now in the jungle of the Amazon, you'll learn pretty quickly how to survive. We have this elasticity, and the robots don't have it. So I think Chelsea's talking about this, and that's why, I mean, this is absolutely interesting, crucial. She's mentioning, Jürgen Schmidhuber, who spoke about something called the Gödel Machine, which is, again, a system that optimizes its learning process, and while learning, learns how to learn. So that's a really interesting problem. We don't have a lot of solutions, she says that herself, but she's working on this. And this is a good example also for all the young people out there who listen to this podcast. Look at her trajectory, look at Chelsea Finn's trajectory, and just see, you can succeed in this world. You don't need to be rich, you don't need to have accolades and country club memberships and rich parents and stuff. It helps, but if you do something unique, if you happen to be in a field that is relevant and fast growing, you can succeed very quickly. And I think Chelsea is a good example. So why are we talking about all this? For new listeners, we often discuss books here, we discuss podcasts, we discuss papers. We're in the knowledge business at Orange Capital Partners. The purpose of this podcast is to give people a sense for what it feels like to run a hedge fund. And doing all these things, running, let's say, reading books, reading papers, writing papers, things like along those lines are not just pastime. We don't do this as a hobby. This is part of our job, and I can't bring this home often enough. We're not just doing this because we're nerds or geeks. This is our job, and that's why we're also doing these reviews. It's to bring across how important it is for people who want to invest in successfully and make money with wealth creation. If that's your business, if you want to do, that's what we do at Orange Capital Partners. There's different types of investors, and that's for another podcast. But if wealth creation is your goal, you better be reading. You better be reading books and novels and papers and academic stuff, and you got to go out there and turn every stone, particularly every stone that has to do with knowledge. This is not a wrong podcast. It's March 26, 2023. This is Krim Delco. It's a Sunday. There's no update for the year. We're up 53.7%. The market's up 3.5%. We're outperforming by 50.2%. So Chelsea Finn, she's an assistant professor at Stanford in AI, and her claim to fame is that she's been doing a lot of work on what's called meta learning. So learn how to learn. Why is that important? Well, how about we could design algorithms that machines can learn, and while they're learning, they learn how to learn. Okay, make it more elastic. She's citing some problems that robotics is facing, in particular the lack of data. So we don't have a lot of data on robotics compared to the internet, which is one of the insights. I mean, we're taking this for granted, but think about it. Why do we have such big advancements in AI since 2012? Well, of course, we had big innovations, Jeffrey Hinton and et al. They had this idea to use convolutional neural nets or something along those lines to classify images, right? But we had the images, we had the internet, we had the images, we had ImageNet. And why are large language models so successful? Because we have Wikipedia, we have all these bodies on the internet. So basically, we have the data. And now with robotics, we don't have something like that yet. And just as a tangent, I think this is where Tesla comes in. This is the big, big advantage of Tesla. And this is why I think Tesla is going to succeed more than anybody else with robotics, because Tesla has this amazing access to data. They have robots, millions of robots driving around every day and doing interventions. This is another thing that Chelsea Finn mentions. She says, if you train a classic robot, let's say you have a robot that has to learn how to navigate in a factory setting, well, you have to constantly intervene, and that's not scalable. So what Tesla has, of course, is an army of robots where the drivers, us humans, the customers, intervene. So they can leverage that data. Now, are they doing a good job at it? That's a different question. But they have access to not just driving data, but also intervention data. And that is what's so powerful about the Tesla model. Now, can they leverage that also into the humanoid robot? Hopefully so. And therefore, we believe that actually Tesla has one of the solutions to Chelsea Finn's problems, which is, again, a lack of data. We don't have enough data, and we have too many interventions. So we have to find more autonomous systems. This is what she says on the podcast. We have to find systems that are more autonomous. So if we take the analogy of a child, of a newborn child, right? You don't have to intervene all the time with the newborn child. It's not every 10 seconds. It's probably every couple of minutes, maybe some every couple of hours. And the older they get, the less you intervene. My son is now 15. I barely intervene anymore in his life. But I still have to intervene sometimes. And often now, of course, it's also, and this is sort of a beautiful thing of the meta-learning, in the meta-learning context, he comes to me and asks questions. So I taught him how to ask questions. I taught him how to find, how to identify problems and formulate them to me so I can help him more effectively. Because me constantly intervening in his life is A, not very productive, and B, of course, with a 15-year-old, as anybody knows who has had teenagers, it's impossible anyway. So if we can teach our kids from early age how to intervene, how to identify problems and ask questions, then that is also a much more successful way for them to learn. So the same applies to robotics, and that's kind of what Chelsea Finn is talking about. I think she's, again, she's talking about meta learning in general. I think that's, I don't know her, so I'm just taking what's coming from this podcast. And Peter asks her, he mentions a paper that she wrote, some mammal paper, I think is the shortcut, where she talks about meta learning, learning how to learn. And that has been one of the most cited papers in AI and so on and so forth. Again, I think the question itself is already fantastic. She actually says she doesn't really have too many solutions. But the concept, the Gödel machine, the learning how to learn, I think these are very, very important problems that I'd like to see Tesla address also. Why am I talking about Tesla for new listeners? Because this is our largest position, and the main thesis within Tesla's position is, of course, the success in AI. So this is very, very relevant for our position. One more point that Chelsea makes, which is interesting. She questions reward functions, and this is another thing which is very interesting. So when you look at reinforcement learning, for example, right? Reinforcement learning is the task is given, and then you either succeed and you get a 1, or you fail and you get a 0, or sometimes you get a 0 if you succeed and a -1 if you fail, and so on and so forth. There's some mathematical optimization in terms of how the reward function works. So, but in general, the idea of a reward function itself should be questioned a lot more. In other words, what kind of reward functions can we give? What's the optimal reward function we could use for a certain task? Chelsea says that she doesn't like reward functions because that's not how the real world works. If you think about it, you're a student, you're at college. uh, What's your reward function? How do you actually figure out if you're doing a good job? Well, first, of course, you have to figure out what is it you want, and then you have to figure out a reward function that puts you on a path towards success, towards what you want. So it's a very complex problem, and quite frankly, most people, most humans don't know how to solve. What's the reward function for the United States of America? What's the reward function for the state of Florida? What's the reward function for the state of Michigan? What's the reward function for North Korea? You see where I'm going here? It's pretty complicated for humans. Anyway, Chelsea's talking about this, and she's opening a new line of research here, which is reward function research. Let's think about what is it we want and how can we achieve it. And if we use reinforcement learning, how can we design proper reward functions? Get back to Tesla and the problem set at Tesla with self-driving. Of course, the reward function there, or the goal would be to drive around with the least amount of accidents and the fastest and most optimal way and most comfortable way. Some sort of some sort of optimization problem, right? It's not, I mean, drive around without accident is not a good problem, because then you just don't drive. That's the least amount of accidents you will get. So you have to get from A to B with the least amount of accidents at the fastest possible time in the most convenient way. Something along those lines, maybe lowest cost also. So though that it's an optimization problem, and now you have to find a reward function that the machine can learn, assuming you use reinforcement learning. If you don't use reinforcement learning, then of course the whole thing is a different type of problem. But in the end, like I said before on this podcast, I believe that all these different types of learning, that's kind of just nomenclature at this point. I think in the end, there's not a lot of difference in terms of what kind of approach we use, that all these learning approaches eventually will converge to what we just call learning. The same way humans, we don't have, it's not like, well, when I go to school, I use reinforcement learning, and when I'm home, I'm more like a GAN type, and then when I play soccer, I'm using convolutional neural nets or something like that. I think we just learn, right? We learn because we incorporate all of these models in our learning process, and that's how AI is going to be. But anyway, right now we're still in the early days, and these models themselves are competing for attention, which is a good thing. And hopefully that eventually then we will have sort of a model, one big sort of meta learning model that we're applying towards learning. So to summarize, discussion with Chelsea Finn, Peter Beal, I highly recommend it. I'll put it in the show notes, the link to the podcast. Chelsea is one of those rare types that is never, even though she's very young and maybe lacks a little bit of wisdom and all those things, she's very eloquent. She knows what she's doing, and she's very aggressively finding new areas of research. Now, she's a researcher, so she's has that. I would say, I don't know if it's unfortunate. She opens doors, but then she doesn't really go very far. In other words, her reward function, of course, is to write papers and be cited a lot and get accolades at the academic level. Her job is not to make money. Her job is not to create robots that actually are in production and commercially viable. She might be a founder of companies and on boards and here and there. Like, unfortunately, that's a disease that we're seeing with biotech also. See our last episode, why we got out of biotech. That's one of the big problems that academics are often involved in things, but they don't go further, right? They don't go further. And Chelsea's an academic. I'm not criticizing her. I'm just saying she's an academic. She opens doors. She says, look, we should question reward functions, but then we don't, she doesn't really have much more to say there. She's kind of opening doors, right? That's her job, and that's fine. I'm just saying, for us investors, of course, that's not good enough. We want to have those doors open, but then we want to also go down some of those paths and see if there's potential for wealth creation. That's our job, and it's actually a nice way to formulate our job, which is we go to, let's say, an academic institution like Berkeley or Stanford, and then we look at all the doors that are being opened there, the new doors, and then we see which one of them has a path that we can go down and actually create wealth. And that's hopefully what Tesla is doing. Or in other words, that's what we believe Tesla is doing. That's why Tesla has a big chance of succeeding. The likelihood of Tesla succeeding in delivering a self-driving robot and a self-driving factory robot in terms of the humanoid robot is very high, because they are solving for some of the problems that actually Chelsea Finn is mentioning. One is the data availability. They have a lot of data. The other is the autonomous nature of the data collection and data annotation, which Tesla is, of course, working on and has also by nature of the fleet. In terms of the meta learning, I think Tesla has some approaches there. Again, the auto labeling, for example, is part of it. Like, how can you design a learning algorithm that is more flexible and better at also learning within situations? Like, just one more thing that Chelsea is mentioning, which is sort of the problem. One of the big problems in reinforcement learning is the trade-off between greedy and exploration. Where greedy means that you have a policy and you always greedily go after a policy. And exploration is that you sometimes lean back and you try new things, right? Even though you have a policy. The analogy of a human would be somebody who, let's say you work at a company and you're just very greedy. Your policy is just to get promotion, 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 promotion. And you know, it's a good thing. You might succeed in getting those promotions, but then maybe you miss something. Like you get promotions. Let's say you work at Apple and you get promoted, and then you're the head of iPods. Well, you should have maybe done a little bit more exploration and worked for that little team that was working on something, some sort of phone, and so on and so forth. And oh, guess what? You would have become the head of iPhone, which is a lot more interesting. Or even, you know, to use the same analogy, how about you do even more exploration, and instead of working on iPhone, you actually work on AI, which is more interesting than working on iPhone. So in other words, back to the robot, the difference between greedy and exploration, like Tesla has that problem. So when the car drives, you know, it obviously has to have a very greedy policy, in a sense. It has to execute fast and be very clear what it wants, and sort of hopefully follow its trajectory, follow its policy all the time. Like, you want to make sure the car always does what it's supposed to do. You don't want it to, you know, think, oh, well, maybe in this particular case I want to be a bit more creative, right? But then, you know, what happens if the car gets stuck in a very unusual situation, what they call edge cases? Maybe exploration would be better, and it can learn while it's stuck in that situation. This is the key. This is what Chelsea is trying to achieve with her robots, and I think that's a problem that Tesla also has. You know, if you're in this very, very unique edge case where there is a sand in the middle of New York and it looks like you're on a beach, but you're actually in the middle of New York, and there's a girl in a bikini next to you because she just walks out of a nightclub. So the car thinks it's on a beach, but it's not on a beach. It's in New York City. So something like that. So, you know, I'm sure we all had that. Those are the types of edge cases that the Tesla AI team always talks about. Maybe in that particular case, instead of going back and retraining the model so it can then have that edge case also, how about it could learn right there? Is there a way to do that? Chelsea opens that door. She doesn't have a lot of solutions right now, but these are interesting questions that we're asking ourselves. I think academics ask themselves, and for us investors, this is key because it helps us navigate the process in how to assess the viability of our investment when it comes to Tesla. Thank you.